chronic anxiety has a gospel. And two of its messages are, you can worry your way to peace, and it's all on me. I must.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. I'm so glad you joined us. Hey, if you're like most people, you're just scrolling through. But if you subscribe, you will get an amazing array of world-class leaders, some of whom you know, some of whom you don't know. And you'll see this interview delivers almost from the get-go. I mean, we're going to talk about anxiety. Do you know you can have anxieties, multiple anxieties? We talk about how to deal with that. What about people who get a kick out of kicking the lead pastor or the leader, and all the other stresses associated with leadership? Steve and I talk about that today. Hey, today's episode is brought to you by my preaching cheat sheet. So if you communicate, if you're a preacher, or actually if you just communicate, I've got a very simple free download for you. It's 10 prompts that you can use to assess whether your message is ready to go before you deliver it. 10,000 leaders plus are using it. You can download your free copy at preachingcheatsheet.com. That's preachingcheatsheet.com. And today's episode is brought to you by BELAY. For an inside peek at how a virtual assistant can transform your life and work, BELAY is offering a free download of their resource, 25 Things a Pastor Can Delegate to an Assistant. Text my name, Carey, C-A-R-E-Y, to 55123. You'll get your free download. That's Carey to 55123. And now to today's conversation with Steve Cuss. Steve, it's really good to have you back.
It's great to be back. Thanks, Carey. Yeah, as I've told you privately, you have changed my life in a lot of ways. You've been an incredible encouragement to me personally, and it's a pleasure to be back on your podcast.
Well, and it's these listeners, man. I mean, I got to tell you, like, you got so overwhelmed the first time you were on the podcast, it literally changed your life. You're doing what you're doing now because so many leaders who are listening reached out. So I just want to give a huge shout out to the tribe that listens to this podcast. You guys take ridiculous action. We're really careful about who we have as guests on this podcast, really careful about the things we say, and you respond. So that's insane. I just want to say thank you so much to all of the leaders. And Steve, obviously that's a reflection on you too, because you deliver so much value. I mean, you know, so many people struggle with anxiety now, and you've spent the last few years coaching and counseling church leaders and leaders exclusively. I would love to start by going over the top 2 to 3 issues, the frequent flyer issues that you just keep seeing surfacing in leaders' lives. Oh,
yeah. Yeah, I love that question. I think one of the top issues that I think we're just now starting to figure out more about is the way that particularly pastors wear multiple hats with every person, every relationship. So in 2018, my wife became a therapist. She stopped being a school teacher, went back to school, became a therapist. She started a private practice. And I told her jokingly, I said, hey, I'm going to preach more guilt and shame from the pulpit, and that'll generate more clients for you. We'll have a whole circle of life thing, you know.
Just induce some religious trauma on people.
That's it.
That's great.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
For the sake of her practice.
Great strategy.
Yeah, very humble idea. And, you know, of course I'm teasing, but she said, oh no, I'm not going to see anybody from our church. And I'm like, wait, what? And she said, oh, it's unethical for a therapist in the state of Colorado to wear more than one hat with anybody. So I can't, if I have a friend hat, I can't also be a therapist. If your daughter and my daughter are friends, that's too many hats. And I just realized, man, pastors only ever wear multiple hats. And so to me, the understanding of, okay, which hats am I wearing with my people? It's always tempting for a leader to feel sorry for ourselves, but it's also tricky for our people. When I'm knocking on somebody's door, they don't know which hat is walking through the door. Is it the pastor, the fundraiser, the friend? You know, so it goes both ways. But then related to that, Carey, I think you and I both had this experience. I'm at home, my pastor hat is off. It's in the closet. And then a congregant comes over and they say, hey, while I'm here, and they've got a criticism, something they didn't like.
I thought you were coming for dinner. Yeah.
Right? I thought this was a friend hat.
I thought this was a friend visit. Yeah.
Let me go get my pastor hat. And so I think one thing I'm encouraging particularly pastors to do is just count up how many minutes a week do you get to be exactly yourself? Do you just get to be you, no title, no vocation, and how many people in your life? And for a lot of pastors, it's actually freakishly small. We struggle to find friendships where there's a single hat relationship. So I think that's a a big issue. Kind of related to that, the second dynamic I would say is we are still, after all these years, we are generally more focused on mission and others than ourself. And the idea of focusing on ourselves feels very selfish to us.
Yeah.
My whole thesis of my work is that the best thing a leader has to offer their people is a well self. And unfortunately, there's plenty of evidence to the contrary. And particularly our Christian leaders listen to this, they may be saying, well, I think Jesus is the most important thing. I would say, look, I'm going to put all my chips in on well self, because the leaders that offer Jesus when they're not well distort the gospel, distort and do damage to the church. So I'm a big fan of a leader learning to know when they're well, when they're not well. Everybody wants to work with a well leader. Nobody wants to work with an unwell leader. Those would be two of the biggest issues I'd say.
Let's go back to hats, Steve. I'm so glad you started there. That is purifying. I mean, I haven't been a pastor for a number of years now. You stepped out of the lead role as well. What are some differences you have noticed now that you're no longer the lead pastor? How have those roles, those expectations, those hats become clearer to you?
It's been fascinating, Carey. I was probably into this new role, this kind of consultant speaker role for 6 months, my wife said, and I'd been a pastor 26 years at this point. And my wife said, how much has criticism reduced in your life now that you're in this new role? And I said, well, wait, what? It's binary. It's gone from 100% to zero. Like I get no criticism. And partly it's because I've kind of become everyone's favorite person when I'm in the room because I bring relief. The guest speaker, all of those dynamics, but also my tools bring relief to leaders. So I'm usually quite enjoyed. But, I'm the same human that pastored my church, but every church has a small committed band of people that get their kicks out of kicking the leader. And I think for most of us, we make the mistake of trying to win them over with our insight. I did that so many times. I'd have somebody misunderstand me and I would just keep meeting with them and give them more insight, more explanation, not realizing they're not interested in my insight. They get their kicks out of kicking the leader. And I do think, every leader has had this happen, whether you're a church leader or even marketplace. This is just what comes with leadership. But what's interesting to me is how cagey and protective we get. I found myself as a pastor, like preemptively guarding myself against people. I remember once the chair of my elders texted me and she said, we need to meet. That's all she put in the text, which is, of course, the dreaded text.
Yeah, you don't sleep after a text like that.
Right. Now, why is that? It's like, why aren't I saying to myself, I wonder if she knows that someone wants to give $250,000 to the church? I'd never.
No.
Immediately I feel in trouble. That's because I've been kicked around so much by others. I start to project that onto good people. She's a great lady, and it wasn't really related, or I wasn't in trouble, that's for sure. When we finally met, I was not in trouble. But boy, my brain worked overtime. So I think that just understanding some of those dynamics can really help people be healthier as leaders.
So not to leave a dangling thread, when you get a text like that, is it okay to text back, hey, sure, I'd love to, what's up?
Yeah. I think it's always wise.
In play?
Yeah.
Because that's what I do now. I don't let that stuff dangle. I'm like, can you tell me what it's about? And maybe that's my anxiety. Maybe that's my I don't know. Now, getting your kicks out of kicking the leader, there's a phrase that'll preach. That resonates. What? And you're saying you don't see it? I mean, I get it because I have a public profile. I don't get a lot of it.
Yeah.
I really, relatively speaking, I think I'm in the bottom percentile of people who get criticized online, at least for now. And I'm grateful for that, not ungrateful. What have you learned about people who get their kicks out of kicking the leader?
I think the biggest thing I've learned is less about them and more about my incessant need to be understood. Now, obviously, my field is chronic anxiety. Chronic anxiety is always based on a false need. There's all kinds of anxieties, but chronic is based on a false need. What's fascinating about this particular kind of anxiety, it's probably better known as reactivity. is it acts like a real threat in the moment. So, I grew up in Western Australia. We have 9 of the 10 deadliest snakes in the world. I know you just recently went there, Carey.
Yeah, so beautiful, especially, were you in Perth?
Perth. Did you get to Perth?
Yeah.
Come on.
Frio, man. Like, come on.
My sister lives in Fremantle. Shout out to Tony and Martin in Fremantle.
So good. I loved it. We can't wait to go back. Yeah.
Yeah. But Australia is also a great place to die. You can die on the land, in the water. We can kill you off in so many ways.
Glad I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. So 9 of the 10 deadliest snakes. Well, there's a particular snake in Western Australia. It's in most of the country called a tiger snake, and it's very aggressive. It'll come after you if you see it. And so, of course, your body has a adrenal reaction when you see a tiger snake. Your brain gets really focused. You run for your life. In my case, you squeal like a little boy. Like all kinds of things happen. But chronic anxiety is really sneaky. It acts like you're under threat, as if you've seen a snake. So when I'm with what I call a usual suspect critic, whether you want to call him a usual suspect or frequent flyer, like you want to give him a punch pass. Every 9 punches, I get to punch you. That was always my dream. I know it's not very Christian to say, but that was my anger fantasy, Carey. I was like, I've tried to meet with you 9 times. The 10th time, let's rumble.
Nobody here is judging you.
Yeah. But in that moment, I had this incessant need to explain myself because I need to be understood. That's a false need. That's not a real need. I can thrive as a human and be misunderstood, but in the moment, my brain is telling me, you must explain yourself. More insight from you will help them see. But they're not interested in my insight. So it's less about them and it's more about my posture. This was really a game changer for me when I realized I can change my behavior and that won't change them, but it will change our dynamic. And so for many of my usual suspects, they were still at the church, but I did not give them my time or my heart or my vulnerability. I never met with them alone. I had a few behaviors once we kind of identified my usual suspects.
Okay, so you kind of put them in a box and didn't let them get to you. Back to the hats. I'm doing some research right now. I've done one talk on this topic in England earlier this year, thinking about it for a new book. But I'm not using the metaphor hats, although that's a really good one. But I'm thinking about the complicated job description of a pastor. It's a box of crazy, man, when you really look at it from the outside looking in.
It's nuts.
Can you say more about that? Because you have got either a lot of church leaders listening or people who are there to try to support church leaders, lay leaders, board members, entrepreneurs who care about the church space and who probably care about their pastor. But what makes, being a pastor the box of crazy that sometimes it is?
I hope you do write that book. I do think we need more appreciation for... Yeah, and I think it is a depth and breadth issue. Yeah. Our mutual friend Glenn Packiam recently posted on Twitter his schedule for the day, just as a lead pastor. He just posted on social media, here's what I did today. And I was reading it thinking, yep, anyone who's a lead pastor has had not just that day, but dozens or hundreds of that day. And in his case, it involved, I may get some of the details wrong. So Glenn and Carey, I apologize if my memory's faulty. But for example, having to attend to the sudden death of a congregant and going to the house and caring for the family, and then managing the budget for the year. And then there was the board meeting and just the breadth of skills required between knowing how to attend to somebody in their grief versus running a spreadsheet. I remember becoming a lead pastor and thinking, I just have to figure out how to do formulas on spreadsheets. Somebody has to figure this out. We were a small church plant, had to be me. And I spent like half a day researching back then the Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. But if I didn't do that, I wouldn't be very good at my job in a small church, So the breadth is an issue, but then the depth is an issue. Like you ask the average pastor, how many people do you know who are battling cancer or a life-threatening illness? And your pastor's answer is going to be 10 times more than your average human's answer. The breadth of what the human condition that comes at us is also tricky. I think the other thing, Carey, I don't know if this was your case, particularly when I was younger, I couldn't really tell the difference between the church's well-being and my well-being. I just merged and enmeshed with the church.
The church is good. I'm good. Mm-hmm.
Oh, everything personally.
Yeah, 100%.
And so if you criticize the church, I felt it. So I do think, listen, I think every vocation has unique challenges. I don't particularly believe that pastors have it worse than others. But I do think understanding our unique challenges is really necessary to help us thrive. We haven't even got to the weekly deadlines.
Oh, yeah.
Just that weekly production of a message. Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot there.
There's a lot. Yeah, that's part of the research I'm doing too, the impossible pressure of sermon prep, particularly in the age of social media and digital exposure.
Yeah.
I think there's something there. I want to go back to, I called it compassion fatigue. And I remember we weren't even at 1,000 people on the weekend before my ability to, number one, track the number of people who were ill, and number two, feel something for the number of people who were ill hit capacity. And I don't know that I have a particularly large capacity for that. I tend to be perhaps not as sensitive as the average shepherding church pastor. I'll just say that. But what do you do with that? It's sort of like the news, right? Like, I don't have the, and this goes back to Neil Postman amusing ourselves to death. This goes back to the invention of the telegraph, when suddenly in middle America, you can know what the Queen of England did on a particular day, which really, for most of human existence, you had no idea. You had no idea what was going on. If you were an indigenous person 3 tribes over, you just knew your tribe. If you lived in a small village in medieval Europe, you probably didn't go more than 50 miles from your home, and you knew the 200 people that you had to deal with every day. And now we live in this mass exposure of news and catastrophe and commercialization, commodification of bad news. And then you have to lead people, and you're supposed to track all of this. And I just found that it was not good for my soul. And I don't know that I was wired to handle that well. What's your take on that?
Oh, man. I mean, it's such a big question. You've got the challenges.
Yes. Just let me lob the universe your way, Steve. Go ahead, catch it.
No, you've got the challenges within your congregation, and then you've also described these global issues. It feels to me that there are 1,000 things wrong with the world, and any local church can tackle 8 of them. And so, that's arbitrary. I may be wrong. And so we tried to focus on the 8 we could really move the needle on, and we tried to sacrifice ourselves for those 8. And then the rest we generally left alone. What I struggle with this part of the question, Carey, is as a person of privilege, I kind of have the privilege of ignoring the suffering.
Yeah.
But I was not ignoring all suffering. I was simply trying to lead us into the suffering that I believed we could actually do something about. And so in our particular church, we did local and global. And we went really deep with a few things. What you're talking about, though, for a pastor, like to me, when I hear you say, look, I'm not really that shepherd, I think there's nothing wrong with that. Like some people like you get a bad rap nowadays, this kind of corporate pastor. I am prone more to shepherding, and I thank God for people like you who are more prone to business and execution of vision. And I just think the body of Christ needs a body of Christ of pastors. We need a whole set of group of pastors. And so the way you lead is better than the way I lead. But what you're trying to look for is people like me who are prone to shepherding. That means we are prone to overcommitting and enmeshing.
Yeah.
So I'm just always trying to set up a boundary. And then people like you who are probably more prone to vision and execution, I may be putting words in your mouth.
No,
you've got a boundary on the other side, which is you might maybe, I don't know, Carey, you might detach a bit too quickly.
Yep.
And in the middle, there's actually a lot of pastoring that can be done by both of us, which is simply listening to people long enough they feel seen and understood. So I am prone to try to fix because your anxiety is too much for me, so I need to shrink it down to make me feel better. That would be my simple way of saying it. You may be prone to kind of detach and say, well, someone else deal with it. But both of us can actually step in, ask curious questions, connect, empathize, and it costs both of us very little to do that.
I think that's one framework I didn't have. I think my natural wiring is, I think I have and some leaders listening will be able to identify with this. I think I'm better at caring for 1,000 people than one person. In other words, I would think about, well, what's good for this larger group? And I think I can probably figure out the law of averages and we can probably go there. But if there were too many ones in the way, it would stop caring for the 1,000. So, but I think you're right. I think one of my questions for you was, I don't seem to be a guy who struggles with anxiety, but now that we're going back to my pastoring times, I'm like, maybe that's not true, because I would feel if someone came to me with cancer, some terrible diagnosis, I would feel that pressure. Like it was like I had to take on everything, all the pain, hospital visitations. Oh my gosh, I don't have time for this. I got, this. And again, if you're dealing with multiples, there's a half dozen or a dozen individuals in your church like that. One person can't bear that and bear it well. So I probably was quicker to disconnect and quicker to scale it so that we have teams for that. We have groups for that. Our serving teams will handle that. But you were describing earlier, I'm thinking about my pastor, Jeff, and on the one moment, he's at a hospice caring for a guy who's dying of cancer. The next, he's raising millions of dollars and trying to figure out architectural stuff. And then he's working on his message. Like I have a lot of empathy for that. Is it the impossible job description?
No, I don't think it's impossible. I do think vocational ministers, pastors are prone to overfunction. I think we are prone to do more than a human is designed to do.
Yeah.
So, you kind of hinted, you're like, am I an anxious? I don't think I'm an anxious person. That's very common. Most leaders that aren't natural warriors and aren't really afraid would say, well, I'm not anxious. But chronic anxiety looks like reactivity. We all have that. We all have false needs we live for. So, no, it's not an impossible job description. The impossibility comes in the frequency and the overfunctioning. When our well-being is attached to the church's well-being and we can't tell the difference. And so then, we can't turn it off at home. That's where it becomes impossible. But no, pastors, to your point, can hire, equip a volunteer to manage the scope of the work. It's doable, but you just have to be aware. I think the guardrails is what the problem is. I think many of us live outside the guardrails of health and we're not aware of it. We're just like, just one more. We just go.
Any other frequent flyer issues that are coming across your radar these days?
The same issues, and said another way, is you add a paycheck to your faith and it complicates everything. So we're kind of circling around the same general theme, but like I got into ministry because Jesus revolutionized my life and I wanted to tell everybody. And then I got paid for it. And now my faith is kind of in the business. It's really messy. So the way I described that, I think we chatted about it last time, is I tend to relate to God too much as God's employee and not enough as God's child. And I think that's still a big pressing issue with pastors.
Any surprising or unusual things that have emerged out of the last 4 or 5 years, which have been unlike anything we've led through before?
Yeah, I've run into a couple of surprises. I keep asking pastors when I meet with them how powerful they feel. And almost every pastor tells me they don't feel very powerful at all. They feel tossed around by congregants. They've got a tough board. But your average congregant thinks your pastor is incredibly powerful. And I started doing this little social experiment after looking at Twitter. Twitter is one of the hobbies of Twitter is taking down a pastor. Like there's some people get a lot of pleasure out of let's take down a pastor. And listen, it's tricky, Carey, because some of these pastors need to be exposed, to be honest. They do.
Sure. There are real abuses that need to be dealt with. True.
It's true. But what's also true is they're still human beings, and we do tend to strip them of their humanity in the takedown. What's interesting is a lot of those pastors feel relatively powerless. They feel bullied. They feel attacked. And so I've been doing some work with this like internal split that pastors have where we get what's the church word for it? We get the hell kicked out of us by these critics. And also we speak for God. And there's this weird extreme that I think makes us really cagey around a lot of people. I think that pastor hat, that's why I go back to that question, how many minutes a week can you be exactly yourself? And how many people in your life can you be exactly yourself around? No pretense, no representation of God, just you. And I think if pastors don't have that, we become less and less human over time, and we become more and more of a caricature. You've probably met this too. I've worked with pastors that when I have lunch with them, they are almost incapable of a dialogue. They're monologuing, not to exaggerate, but they're almost alliterizing their talk. But they are. I've had this where I'm sitting down and I'm like, I thought we were just having a conversation, but they're actually leading me through a narrative to a point. They've preached too much. The 1,000 sermons has changed their brain. And so I just think it's so important for pastors to be human-sized, and that also relaxes the congregation. There's a lot of well-meaning pretense in the church, and it's too much pressure.
Is that even possible?
Oh, yeah.
How do you become just authentically you when and not a role attached to you? I think I've discovered that in the last 8 years since I haven't been a lead pastor. But I thought it was a thought experiment prior to becoming not a lead pastor when I was still a lead pastor, because I was never not in the job. Do you know what I mean? So if you're going to be able to do it, how would you do that?
Carey, I made so many mistakes as a lead pastor. I don't know any lead pastor that hasn't gone through it and said, oh man, I would do things differently.
That's why I do what I do today.
Well, I think you do what you do. I think you're living God's calling for your life personally. But one thing I'm proud of what I did is when I came to our church, I'd never been a lead pastor before. Now, we were a small church plant in a portable building. So you might say, well, there wasn't much to lose. Oh, I think there was. But the elders and I got up in front of the congregants and basically played our hand when I came and took the role, and basically said, this is Steve. He's raw material. He's never done this before. He's been a pastor before. He's never been a lead pastor, and he's going to need a few years to grow into the role. And so I never pretended. I didn't have any pressure to pretend to be anything other than what I was, which is a rookie. I think one of the challenges of pastors is we overfunction. We take too much responsibility. One simple example, Carey, would be we feel responsible to provide care for everybody. But actually, the role of a pastor is to take responsibility for everyone to be cared for. That's different. So that means that I'm creating a culture where I also am being cared for. So in my church, it was never inappropriate. It was never me using the congregation for therapy. But I shared my doubt with the church. This next book that I just released is all about, this is my own story of struggling to encounter God as a pastor. None of my book will be surprising to my congregants. They'll read it and they'll say, oh yeah, Steve's preached that like hundreds of times. So I think it's actually very possible for a pastor to be exactly human-sized, learn on the job, admit your mistakes, share your doubts appropriately. And what it ends up doing is that it does attract bullies. I attracted some bullies. They get their kicks out. Like when you share your vulnerability, it will attract some bullies. It will also attract vulnerable people who are spiritually hungry. They're the best people any church will ever have. But I also attracted like spiritual sages that took me under their wing. I'm their pastor. They're older than me, and they shepherded me. And so in my 16 years, it really was a beautiful exchange of care between me and the congregants. Same with my staff. I cared for my staff, but some of my core leaders that worked for me gave me great care. And that meant I didn't have to be some kind of a thing that God never asked me to be. I can be human-sized. So I am passionate about this. I think we can all do that.
When you look at the health of pastors today, think if you looked at all of us in 2019, we didn't know what we were stepping into. We got the snot kicked out of us. And, here we are today. Are we more resilient? Are we healthier? Are we still limping? What's your assessment of the state of the health of church leaders in this moment?
I am really encouraged by this, what I'm seeing. I'm definitely seeing church teams that really want to make an impact in their community and around the world. Like good people banding together, wanting to make a difference. I'm seeing a higher value on team well-being than I saw before COVID. I think before COVID, it was a little bit of mission focus. And now it's more, are we well together? And I'm glad to see that. There's always a concern with driven leaders that the more we work on our relational integrity, the less mission we get. I can prove all day long that the better your team cohesion, the further you'll get on your mission. So I'm seeing a lot of that. I'm generally encouraged. I think what happened through COVID, when I was a chaplain, I did a lot of emergency room work. And one of the chaplains pulled me aside. He said, Steve, when you're rushing down to the ER to meet the family, right? Like what happens is somebody's coming through the double doors on a gurney. They've come on a helicopter or an ambulance. They're the person in the accident. But then a minute or two later, this very shocked family walks in. They've got the phone call and they're rushing in to see how their loved one is. And of course, my job is to care for all of them. The chaplain said, your job is to figure out what was going on in that family 1 minute before their phone rang. Like before the crisis hit, what was the dynamic? And the crisis didn't create that dynamic in the family. It just reveals it. That's how I see COVID. I just think leaders just blew into COVID thinking we were fine. And COVID didn't create anything. It just exposed everything. So if COVID kind of locked us down in March of 2020, what was happening in January? Same. Leaders running on fumes, ignoring well-being, acting out of reactivity, and then COVID just exposed it all.
I think that's a fair analysis. So you would say there's been an improvement. First of all, huge casualty rate over the last few years. A lot of people who were in leadership aren't anymore.
Yeah.
But those who remain are overall taking their health more seriously, which is good. If you look at the data, particularly the Barna data, there seems to be a dividing line over 45, under 45, and almost, I'm sure you've seen the data, but almost every marker, faith, well-being, resilience, you name it, the under 45s are not flourishing. And I don't know whether that's ministry specific or whether that's just, we've heard about Gen Z being a non-resilient generation. What are you seeing in particular in younger leaders, and any words to them? Because we get a lot listening to this show.
It's interesting. I have seen that data, and my experience with what I would call the Gen Z. Do you say Z or Z in Canada?
I say Z. Well, Canada's split.
Yeah.
Canada's split. Some say Z, but I get nasty looks in Canada when I say Z. We're supposed to say Z. I was just in England. They say Z. Yeah. But 80% of people listen to the show are American. So I've Americanized the pronunciation.
Well, that's very kind of you. I feel
about
obligated
to be deported
to the
from my home country.
Yeah, so. I was about to say, yeah. I have an obligation to the Queen, the late Queen of England, to say
I was going to say, she's now the late Queen.
Yeah, the late Queen.
To say Z.
It's interesting, isn't it? I think what Barna has picked up on is the natural insecurity that young people face, that as you get older, you just wonderfully are less attached to your performance. So I do think what we talked about before, the way we tend to enmesh our well-being with the church's well-being, that's like your stereotypical young church planter.
Yeah, that was me at 35. It was not me at 55.
Yeah, it's all on my shoulders, And that's actually, Carey, that's what chronic anxiety does. Is chronic anxiety has a gospel, and two of its messages are, you can worry your way to peace, and it's all on me. I must. Chronic anxiety is one of the number one reasons why we don't notice the Lord, because we're so busy in self. We're so busy trying to do for God that we don't, know how to relax into God's presence. But on the other side of Barna, I am seeing a lot of Gen Zs that actually have a pretty epic work-life balance, where they actually have seen our generation pour it all out, and they are trying to figure out a less enmeshed relationship with their work. I find myself defending Gen Z and millennials to older generation. The other interesting thing I would just point out is our Gen Zs and I'll say Z for, I know most of our audience are like tripping up on the Z here. By the way, Carey, it's zebra, not zebra, if I may. If I may.
Really? I've never heard that. Zebra?
Oh, come on. Okay.
Zebra.
I try so hard.
Canadians are in between America and Britain. We just are. It's like we weigh peppers and meat in grams, but we measure ourselves in pounds. We travel in kilometers, but I'm like 6'2". So it's just this mashup hybrid that nobody really understands.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh, man. The other thing that our Gen Z and our millennials do is they're fluent in the language of anxiety. And this can trip up, I'm a Gen Xer, and our boomers, we get tripped up by it. And our tendency is to say, just get over it. Our grandparents fought Hitler and they weren't anxious. Yeah. I would just say, well, they did drink a lot. Let's be honest. And also for many of them, their spouses said, he came home and he was a stranger to me. So our younger generation is actually teaching us how to be more in touch with ourselves. What's interesting is they present like they're not very resilient, but after that initial anxiety conversation, there's a profound resilience in a lot of our young people. So I think it's actually on us older generations to learn how to listen to that language and then see what's past it. So I'm a big defender of the younger generation. I think
so it might be that their self-assessment is a little more sober or realistic than over 45s. My wife and I are jumping on a plane in a couple of weeks to head down for a few days with some young church leaders, couples. And we're just going to spend 3 days with them, build into them. I'm so excited for that because like you, I'm pretty bullish on the next generation and excited for them.
And if I may, I'm sorry, they're not cynical. I was cynical at their age. They're incredibly optimistic. They love the local church. So I do think the local church in general, as it is now, is in some trouble. As like it is changing, institutional trust, all of that. But we do have a generation that's pretty darn excited about proclaiming the gospel. It's pretty cool.
We've thrown some terms around anxiety, general anxiety. Can you give us a little bit of definition? Back to my comment, I don't know that I'm somebody who struggles. Like I have so many friends who are like, man, I've just got chronic anxiety. Some of them take medication, some don't. I would say I'm a relatively low anxiety personality, but maybe I'm fooling myself. Like how would you know whether you struggle with anxiety?
Okay, what a great question. If you're not sure that you're an anxious person, the fastest way to know is to ask somebody who loves you, who knows how to tell you the truth. Unfortunately, Carey, in your case, that's your wife.
Yeah, Tony.
Yep, Tony, Mrs. Nieuwhof. And you're just going to ask her, how do you know I'm anxious before I know I'm anxious? And she'll know.
She knows.
She'll know. And typically, so what happens is the problem with the word anxiety is it's one word that covers so much territory. We won't grow as a culture until we change it to a plural. We need to learn to start talking about anxieties, not anxiety. Because if we start talking about anxieties, that raises the question, well, what kind of anxiety is it? And so we have, for example, you mentioned medication. That's like a classic depression anxiety disorder. So there are anxieties that are best treated chemically. It used to be with depression that if you were struggling with depression, you would go and talk about it. But now, more often than not, the first thing you do is get your blood drawn. You still go to talk about it, but we're learning more and more. Okay, this is a chemical thing. Let's get your chemicals straight. So if we look at those anxieties that require mental health medication, which as a pastor, I have to say, I think is a gift from God. If you need mental health medication, you should thank God and take mental health medication. It's a good thing. I do not struggle with that. I never have, Carey. It sounds like you don't either. I wake up, to use an American football term, I wake up on 1st and goal almost every day. I wake up happy and optimistic almost every day. But people that struggle and need medication, they wake up in the wrong end zone. Now, me waking up at 1st and goal, the ball's in my hand, I can read the defense, that's not my fault. You can't blame me for being happy. In the same way, people that wake up in the wrong end zone, Mental health medication doesn't get them down to first and goal, but it does get them further down the field. They're not under threat of a safety. Then you have anxieties that are related to something that physically happened to your body, PTSD, trauma. Your average military veteran, your average abuse survivor. That's a different field. And the problem there is their safety radar has become unreliable. And so what happened to them is real, but it's now not just in their past, it's in their body. So they're very easily triggered. A safe example would be my wife, who is a trauma therapist. She has been in a number of car accidents in her life. Some where she was the driver, some where she was the passenger. And so when I'm driving, her body is on high alert, even though I'm a safe driver. It's got nothing to do with me. She's very jumpy. Her safety radar is on hypervigilance. Like, I'm a safe driver. I'm checking all my mirrors, but she is always on hypervigilance. Now, when somebody has untreated trauma like that, they will burn out because they do not have enough minutes a week where they can be exactly themselves, where their safety radar can go down. So go back to our pastors. Our pastors have this safety radar saying, can I be myself with this congregant? Can I be myself with this elder? And oftentimes the answer is no. Well, you take that to an extreme with a trauma survivor, and what happened in the past, it's in their body, but Carey, it's also in their future, and they walk into every room, say that person's a threat when they're not. Now, then we have acute anxiety. That's when you see a snake and you run for your life and scream like a little boy.
That's what you should be doing, though, right?
Yep, that's appropriate. That's because it's also based on something real. Acute anxiety would be Mary and Joseph when they lost Jesus at the temple. They came rushing back. Anytime you lose a child,
I've lost my kids.
Yeah, I've lost all of my kids. I'm very proud. Yeah, 2 of them, by the way, when my wife was out of town. She may be learning some of this for the first time. But my field is chronic anxiety, and it's sneaky because it's never based on something real. It's always based on something false.
Yeah.
So it's my need to be liked. And the way you can tell your chronic anxiety is the overreaction when you don't get it. So I don't know if you'd be a perfectionist, Carey, or more of a control freak, but there are 5 core false needs of every human. The easiest one to see is perfectionism. A perfectionist, when they make a mistake, it's almost always not a big deal, but in their mind, it's the biggest deal. That's chronic anxiety. So to circle back, I know I've talked about a lot. Are you an anxious person? Ask Tony. But one solution to chronic anxiety is detaching. And typically, somebody like you, I'm always careful to talk directly, but somebody like you would tend to detach because you don't want to get into it. Whereas someone like me tends to enmesh. So one of my false needs is I need to be needed. So when somebody has a need, I can't tell between their need and my need to be needed. I tend to always overcommit. Whereas somebody who's maybe a bit more cool, they will tend to not want to tolerate the nonsense.
Yeah, that would be me. I'm going to take a step back, or I'm just not going to engage.
Yep. So that's oddly enough an attempted solution to chronic anxiety, because your body is telling you, get out of it. I can't. You're saying, who has time for this? But actually, you could be in it and be just fine.
Yeah, interesting, because I think this is what Tony would say, and she's probably listening to this, so I will maybe have to issue a retraction or correction. But what she would say is, when I'm stressed, I go to control. And control for me these days is, particularly in the summer, I'll go mow the lawn. I'll go get that last leaf off the patio. I'll organize my office. Like, my tolerance for any disorder goes to 0. Yep. And it used to express itself as frustration, grumpiness, and anger. I'm working on that more. Yep. And now I just kind of go out, do my thing for a half hour, 20 minutes, an hour. And then I'm like, okay. But I would say, I don't take that to bed with me. I'm asleep within 10 minutes. I don't wake up ruminating as a rule. There's a couple of things that will get me ruminating, but they're usually personal and people close to me. So they're not issues. It's like people in that inner circle who might be struggling. That will bother my sleep. Other than that, It really doesn't. I wake up like you at first and goal most days. Like, yeah, had a great night's sleep. Let's go for it. That can get deflated over the course of a day, depending on what a day brings. Yeah. But I usually wake up in that resilient place. And I generally have an optimistic view of the world and some confidence. So, I look at that and I'm not trying to say, oh, this is great. But I just want to know do I struggle with anxiety? I want to figure that out, because when I do, it goes to control, and control goes to the environment. I would say that's my number one response.
This is a really, I'm so glad you're asking. This is a really common case that I work with people. Is your average leader that is a strong leader, they see anger or that kind of irritability as a strength. Yeah. And it's in fact an anxious response. And that's why it's confusing, because you probably just think about anxiety as somebody that's just fretting and worrying. But
cowering in the corner, whereas I come out, chest out, ready to go.
Yeah. So there's two reactions. There's self-pity, which is the one you're more but then there's self-righteousness, which is, and I'm the same, Carey. I tend to go to self-righteousness. So the way we talk about it is there's human size, then there's bigger than human and smaller than human. I get self-righteous when I'm anxious. Why isn't everyone doing their job? Why? I kind of get into this judge and jury thing.
Yeah.
But to your point, it's quite possible that you're a very healthy person and that you slip into occasional bouts of anxiety. That would be a very normal thing. But that anger, that need to control. So just really quickly, the 5 core false needs: control, perfection, knowing the answer. That's one of mine. If I'm in a room and I know the answer, I need you to know I know. It's so hard for me to say, I don't know. So control, perfection, knowing the answer, being there for people when they're hurting, and people's approval. Now,
I probably was 5 for 5 as a younger leader. I think I'm 2 for 5 today.
And each of those 5 are God's core attributes. God is in control, so humans don't have to be. God is perfect. God knows everything. God is there for everybody. We don't have to go. They call it a Messiah complex, right? When you're always saving the day. God gives us our approval. We're unconditionally loved. Chronic anxiety shows up when we are stepping into God's realm. As let's suggest that you might be a control freak.
All anxiety. You don't need to suggest that. That's an established fact.
Okay. So all anxiety is simply the twisting of your gifting into an extreme. So you're probably, Carey, very good at making sure the experience is great. So these young people you're heading down to, I can probably guarantee to those young people, Carey's going to give them a great experience because you're thinking through the whole environment, what it's going to be like. That's your gift from God. I'll give an example. I spoke at a conference, and it was one of those hotel rooms, the ballroom. And I walk in, and the conference organizer had seen that there weren't many power outlets in the ballroom. So she went to Home Depot, bought extension cords and power strips so that she could duct tape. Every table had a power strip waiting. So when you walked into the conference, you sit at the table, there's a power strip, you plug in your device. Now, that is a thoughtful person. But if you take her, and I said to her, oh, do you ever struggle with control? And she's like, how did you know? We just met. Because she's attention to detail. She's thinking through my experience. That's human size. She can be thoughtful and attention to detail and not be anxious. But if she was sitting as I'm teaching, I did a workshop, and if she's worried about is everyone having a good time? Man, John looks bored. Now she's in a control freak status. So every one of us, I'm a good carer, but I need to be needed. So one of those is like my gift from God. And then at one extreme, it becomes my source of anxiety.
This is so helpful. And, the reason I'm interested in the conversation is I just know I can get better. And I know that if I get better, the people closest to me are going to have a better experience of me, right? They're not going to absorb all the shrapnel when I'm rattled or I'm upset about something. And, it leads to greater self-regulation, as Daniel Goleman so famously said all those years ago. This is so helpful. So, Steve, you got a new book. I want to mention it quickly. It's called The Expectation Gap. And you deal with an issue that I think a lot of people struggle with. And I'll just lob it to you this way. You said you feel more like an employee than a child of God. I can easily, just based on my own natural default theology feel like I'm performing for God rather than responding to God. In other words, I hope I get it right. I'm doing my best here, rather than, oh man, you are like unconditionally loved. So talk about that. Why'd you write it? And what were some of the expectation gaps you encountered?
Yeah. I think every Christian has 3 gaps. We have more, but the 3 most common are, I believe God loves me, but I don't feel it. I believe God's with me. I don't see it. I thought I'd be further along in my faith by now. Those are the 3.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, Carey, I was looking around, I'm trained in systems theory. I've been trained to notice recurring patterns. And so I noticed in our churches, why aren't we saying that it was easier to follow God in the Bible than it is today? We tend to lionize the global persecuted church. We tend to lionize the disciples in Acts chapter 2. But it was simpler back then. And I don't hear anyone saying it, really. Like, following Jesus was tangible. If I'm a disciple, where is he? Oh, there he is. Okay, let me walk. I can literally follow him. Now, I may not understand what he's saying. He may baffle me most of the time. I may be tapping Thaddeus on the shoulder and saying, what the heck is he talking about? Sure. But he was tactile. And even in Acts chapter 2, how many churches have Acts chapter 2 as their vision, their goal? But listen, if you and I were in church, Carey, like if you came to my church this Sunday and Robin came up to give the announcements, and as Robin's giving the announcements, like the storm blew this kind of fireball and it rested on her head. And you and I are like, man, her hair is not burning up. That's weird. And then she starts speaking Farsi. And suddenly the refugees behind us are crying because she's speaking in their language. And then she says, hey, this refugee family just moved here. They need a car. We would probably hand our keys over because we witnessed the tactile experience of God. But nowadays, most of us, even my charismatic sisters and brothers, would admit it's hard to experience an invisible God. So I wanted to just come clean as a pastor and say, listen, this is hard. It's less tangible. Like, I can experience you. I can hold my wife's hand. I can tell my friend a joke and he can laugh at me. But relating to God is much less visceral. It's much less tactile. So I wanted to write a book just to show us how can we actually engage an invisible God in more tangible ways. And the other thing I was noticing is, look, I have bet my whole life on freedom in Christ. Why is my body not free? Like, my brain believes in freedom. My body does not. I'm all bound. My brain believes in the love of God. And so, I got pretty deep in the book. Like, to be frank, Carey, as I dug deeper and deeper into my life, I realized, okay, my belief in Jesus is not my core belief. I've always thought it was. It's my most precious belief, for sure. Jesus is my most precious, but I have these beliefs that take over my life. And one of my deepest beliefs, it took me a while to find it, is that I'm not worth loving. I'm not worth your time. Even now, I'm probably boring you. Like, it's crazy, Carey, the things that I say about myself. And so in the book, I kind of show us these deeper messages are gospels. And I'm putting way more faith in that message than in the goodness of Jesus. So when Jesus says that God knows the number of hairs on my head, I'm like, no, he doesn't. Like, he doesn't bother with me.
So where do those beliefs come from? Because I think we all have them. I have them. I mean, totally. I've never said this before, but often when I'm prepping for Wednesday interviews, we usually do these on a Wednesday, I'm like, all right, here we go. I hope somebody will listen to this. Now, I know the math. I know people are listening to it, but I don't feel the moment. Do you know what I mean? Now, often when I see the response, I'm like, oh yeah, this is a great episode. Or I see it after, but in the moment, it just feels, and I mean, by the way, for the record, this has been a fantastic interview. Man, it just started with a bang and it keeps going. So that's my honest assessment of it. I've had 2 great ones today, but yeah, getting ready for it, I don't always feel it either.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it does go back to our childhood. You don't have to rummage around.
I knew you were going to go there.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
You don't have to rummage around in your childhood. But basically, as a simple idea, kids are powerless in a world of power. And so we simply don't get all of our needs met, even from the most loving people in our life. You know, what could be for your dad or your school teacher could just be another Wednesday for them is a colossal wound for you. You know, like that's the way it works when you're a kid. I have a friend where the school teacher dragged him up in third grade in front of the class and used him as an example of what not to be. Now, let's be honest, not that school teacher's finest moment, but here's what's crazy. That might be a decent teacher who was having a really bad day. She may not remember that, but for my friend, it shaped his whole life. And he made an agreement with himself. I will never be that exposed again. I'm going to protect myself. So most of our anxiety and the condemnation that we carry is a weird form of self-protection. Have you ever worked with a perfectionist that when you sit down with them, they point out all the mistakes in their project before you can? They're like preempting you. I've had that happen. I've had perfectionists work for me. We'll have a one-on-one and they'll say, Steve, before you get started, let me show you where I did it wrong. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I wouldn't have even noticed.
That's what is that voice in your head, right?
That's what your inner critic is doing, is it's condemning you to protect you from exterior condemnation, but it's competing with the gospel of Jesus. John says in 1 John 3:19-20, this is how we relax into God's presence, is the way I would say it, is even when our heart condemns us, God is greater than our heart and he knows everything. So whenever we are vulnerable and exposed, which we are with God, God knows everything and sees everything. Whenever we're vulnerable and exposed, we try to protect ourselves by condemning ourselves so that God can't. And by doing that, it's hard for us to then relax into the love of God because we're depending on ourselves to be well instead of relaxing into God's love. So that's kind of in a nutshell. I get into it more in the book on how to do that, but that's kind of what's happening.
Let's talk about feeling it in your body. Your body not releasing it. I think, it's still on the New York Times bestsellers list. Not an easy book to read. I haven't read it for full disclosure, but my wife has. The Body Keeps the Score by, what is it? Vessel van de Kolk? Something like that. Dutch dude. Anyway, and talks about the body holding on to trauma. So how does that work? And how would you know you're experiencing that? And what do you do about it?
Such a great question. We would benefit from Mrs. Cuss, the friendly neighborhood trauma therapist, being on the show. Most of what I've learned about trauma, I know from Lisa. But it's still true, whether it's trauma or not. Our body reveals our core beliefs, and our brain holds our precious belief in Jesus, particularly those of us, like I'm in a stream of Christianity that's highly cognitive. And
Same.
And I'm bent toward the cognitive. And so I believe in God's love. I can tell it to, I can quote the verses, but my body acts as if I have to earn it or provide it, or there's never enough of it to go around, or I've lost it. And so you can learn over time. And again, it's really important for me to give tactical tools, because on a podcast like this, I don't want to leave people hanging. But in the book, I lead us through a series of tools where you can learn to physiologically relax into God's presence.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah. So if you can notice, control, next time you go to mow the lawn out of grumpiness, which may happen less and less as you get older. That's not uncommon, Carey, that we all mature.
It does happen less and less, but it does still happen. Well, I actually enjoy mowing the lawn. As anyone who follows me on Instagram knows, it's a happy obsession.
Well, and Tony could maybe help us here by provoking you. Maybe she would do us all a favor and provoke you into anxiety. And then
that never happens, Steve, never.
But if the first step is noticing. So if you can learn to notice your body, you notice 3 places: your spinning mind for some of us, racing heart for some of us, and then tightening body for some of us. And if you can learn to first notice your physiological reaction, or for some people, Carey, it can be as simple as realizing I'm not on the couch watching Netflix, I'm binging. I've gone from relaxing to binging. That would be the same with eating and drinking. A glass of wine, great. A bottle of wine, that's a problem. And so what you're noticing is your coping mechanisms when you didn't get what you think you needed, control or needing to be liked, whatever it is. And then you are intentionally diffusing your anxiety and remembering God's presence. So I've talked before about a life-giving list. I'm just trying to, it's still one of my favorite tools. I'm just trying to stub my toe on the love of God 8 to 12 times a day. So that's one thing. In the new book, I've got a new tool. I'm really excited about it. I call it Put Yourself on Your Conscious List of Relationships. Carey, I need to work on the title. It's a little long, but that's the tool. Put yourself. If I were to ask you, Carey, who are you in relationship with? Yeah. You would get to your second cousin twice removed before you would name yourself. We just don't consider that we're in relationship with ourselves, but we are. And then it gets really interesting when I say, okay, list 3 things that you do for people you love. List 1 thing you do to yourself you would never do to someone you love.
Oh, yeah.
So in my life, I call my friends and I check on them. When they tell me how they're doing, I believe them. I don't say, suck it up, Dave. I'd never say that to Dave, even though I say it to myself all the time. And then I try to give them words of encouragement. Something I do to myself, I started this tool in 2016, so I don't do this as much anymore. I used to call myself a moron 50 to 100 times a week. Yeah, I actually counted it in the research for this. I took inventory of my life. So I would never, Carey, never in a million years call you a moron. Call you a moron? No. But I freely do it to myself. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm so obsessed with loving my neighbor as myself, I've forgotten to love myself as my neighbor. And how can I relax into the love of God when I'm treating myself so poorly? This is not self-actualization. This isn't some kind of self-improvement. I'm talking about worship. So what I picture with my conscious list of relationships is, first of all, number 1, I'm in relationship with myself. Do I know how I'm doing? And for me, most often I don't. Somebody says, how are you doing, Steve? And I say, I'm fine, which is code for, I have no idea. I don't think about it. Yeah.
That is what it's code for.
Yep. So if you're like me, then
Haven't thought about it.
I've committed to wait until I know the answer. When somebody now asks me, I say to them, I don't know how I'm doing. I'm so glad you asked because I don't know. Let's wait and see. And it usually takes me about 30 seconds. And that's when I discover, the reason they're asking how I'm doing is they know I'm anxious and I don't know I'm anxious. It's really humbling, especially as an anxiety expert. Like, I'm still generally out of touch with my anxiety. Now that I've done that, I can start to realize the way I treat myself, I would never treat my friends. What if I started to treat myself the way I treat my friends? So now I've learned to check on myself a few times a day, and I've learned to believe myself. I was raised in a family where I didn't have the rights to my emotions. And look, I was raised in a great family, but we did not give ourselves permission to have emotions. And so believing myself has been huge for me, Carey, because what we do as leaders is we syncretize our anxiety with the gospel. So I would say, well, a pastor doesn't get to be a human. I'm a pastor. I got to get back in there and go and get pummeled and let them treat me like a punching bag and meet with all these people with cancer, but I can't grieve. But believing myself, I've now opened my life up to a world of emotions. It's very uncomfortable for me. And I get to feel my feelings and I'm a healthier person. That was a long answer, but that's a way that you can relax into God's presence.
We syncretize our emotions with the gospel.
Yeah.
It's huge. Is there, I know I read the book to endorse it months and months and months ago and then
you did.
Refreshed. Is that in the book or have you written on that elsewhere?
Yeah.
We syncretize our emotions with the gospel.
I don't know that I said it quite that succinctly, but yes,
it's good, man.
It's in there.
The implication for preaching, if you're preaching to 100 people or 1,000 people or 10,000 people, everyone is syncretizing what you are saying about the gospel to their emotions. Never thought about it that way. Wow. Love to go to the third point you talk about. I thought I'd be further along by now. Enter every leader everywhere. And I've had the privilege of hanging out with some of the top, leaders of the biggest churches, the biggest companies, the biggest organizations in America, in the world, almost to a person. There's two things, and I think they're both sincerely true. Number one, I had no idea it would be this big.
Yeah.
And I thought I'd be further along by now. you know, it's like I would put myself in that category. Never thought I would be doing what I'm doing. Never thought it would have this kind of reach. And I think I would be further along by now. What's underneath that?
What's underneath that is the human's desire to be God. To be blunt.
Oh, sorry, I asked the question. Next question. Yeah.
The very first temptation that humans were offered in the Garden of Eden is you can be like God. And so we try to be in control. We try to be perfect. We try to know everything. We refuse to realize I am a human being, and history has been changed by human-sized followers of a supernatural God. But most leaders try to be superhuman, and we cross into God's territory. But honestly, Carey, to be frank, I wrote the chapter for congregants more than leaders, because what we do in the church is we perpetuate assumptions, and then we read those assumptions onto Scripture. So we share cliches with each other that aren't in the Bible, but then when we open our Bible, we read them on. So the simplest example, I put it in the book, is Peter walking on water. Like, have you ever heard a sermon or read a book where somebody says, all right, everyone, Peter walked on water, 11 disciples did not walk on water. At the end of the story, all 12 worshiped Jesus. So here's a good exegetical treatment of the passage. Stay in the boat, watch your friend almost drown, you'll worship Jesus anyway. But every week in our pulpits, we expect our whole congregation to be Peter that week.
Get out of the boat.
Get out of the boat.
Have
walk
some
by
faith.
There's some interesting things here. Peter walked on water one time in his life, but we feel a low-grade guilt that we should always, every week, be walking on water. 92% of the disciples stayed in the boat. We don't talk about them. What about our congregants that, for example, maybe they are risk assessors for an insurance company? Maybe they're really good at assessing risk. And so while Peter is walking on water, they've opened a spreadsheet in the boat and they're like doing a cost-benefit analysis of walking on water. Is that person allowed to be a follower of Christ, or must they always be Peter? Until the next week we come to church, and now the text is Mary and Martha. And now we're being told off that we're too busy. We should sit at Jesus' feet like a freaking contemplative. But what's interesting, Carey, is Peter and Mary are nothing like each other. But we have to be both of them. So that's what I get into in the book, is the way we're very well-meaning with our use of Scripture, but we are perpetuating a well-meaning legalism by taking these point-in-time stories in the Bible and creating a fictional super disciple that none of us will ever be, and none of the people in the Bible were either. So
and we're Moses and we're David, but not that kind of David. David against the Philistines, but not David with Bathsheba, right? Like it's so
When have you heard a sermon say, hey, be David, lay naked with a concubine in your old age? Nope. Not that kind of, we don't want that kind of David. I mean, obviously I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek, but this is the problem. And so, you know, in my training and systems theory, one of my favorite things is to notice attempted solutions. It's the step past problems. To get back to leadership, one of the problems is leaders focus on problems, when if we learn to focus on our attempted solutions to the problems, we would get further as leaders. So if the problem, going right back to the beginning of our conversation, if the problem was my usual suspect critics that get their kicks out of kicking, they're not the problem, Carey. I'm the problem, because my attempted solution is the problem. What's my attempted solution? Give them more of my insight, more of my insight. So once I noticed my attempted solution and stopped it, it changed the problem. So the two signs of an attempted solution are more of the same and try harder. You have an employee, they're chronically late for work, you sit them down, you give them your insight. They're still late, you then try harder to give them more insight. They're still late, you do more of the same, another meeting. You're the problem now. You're the problem. That's an attempted solution. Christians have this relationship with the Bible where we open to the book of Acts chapter 2 and we say, look at what they did. They sold everything. They were in fellowship. They broke bread. They prayed. Well, that's the vision of the church. But our attempted solution is we should try harder to be more like them. We should do more of that. And we can't. We are in 21st century Western culture is radically different than the Roman Empire. We're not in the shadow of Pentecost the way they were. And so we end up trying harder, more of the same, and we're missing God through that whole journey.
We have touched on so much, and it has been such a rich conversation. And I'm going to ask you, this might be impossible to answer, and if it is, just take a pass. But I want you to imagine that 5 years from now, church leaders are much healthier. You said already, we're a little bit healthier, maybe significantly healthier than we were 5 years ago, which is awesome. But if we were all going to be much healthier 5 years from now, and I know there's 100 things we could do, but what is one thing you would say, pay attention to this, focus on this?
If you don't mind me giving two quick things, there are two things every leader can do. Every leader can make 3 columns. What's mine to carry? What's God's? What's theirs? I don't know who theirs is for you. It could be your critics. It could be the rest of your staff. But what's mine, what's God's, what's theirs? That will help a leader delineate the division of labor and do what God has asked them to do and not overfunction. And then closely related, if leaders could believe that the best thing they have to offer their people is a well self, then that would change everything. Our scandals would decrease rapidly. Just as a general statement, these famous Christian leaders that fell into scandal, if we could be oversimplistic, they simply weren't well. And then their attempted solutions to not being well was the problem. And then that happened for decades. I mean, I'm being a bit simplistic, but that's essentially it. They weren't well.
It's a fair analysis.
Their attempted solutions and also the solutions of their board weren't well. And so if we could all work on being well, our chance, whether we're a church leader, marketplace leader, our chance of displaying Christ goes through the roof when we are well. And what that looks like, being well, is simply that we are relaxing into God's presence. We are experiencing God as much as we're proclaiming God. We're no longer well-meaning hypocrites where we proclaim God more than we experience God. And that our team, when you're well, it doesn't mean you're perfect. It means that you're all holding each other's proclivities. My team know that I get combative, that I rush in to try to save the day. They know that about me, but I know their proclivities, and we just have a grace for each other. So it's not about being perfect and being this amazing Christian. It's just about being human together. And that's how we change the world. And really, some of Christianity's best leaders today are an example of that.
You mean the people who are finishing well?
Yeah, I'm talking about, you and I both get to work with people who are leading, for example, billion-dollar Christian organizations that are world-changing. I know several of them that are phenomenal, healthy leaders. And of course, it's not always about size. I know equally people that no one's ever heard of that are obscure, somebody
leading
somewhere
a church
changing.
of 100 in the country after 60 years of ministry and just beautiful human beings.
Yeah, doing incredible global work in Jordan or Iran, under the radar of our awareness, changing the world.
Well, the new book is called The Expectation Gap. And of course, if you're not one of the 5 leaders who hasn't read Managing Leadership Anxiety, I would highly recommend that you get that book as well. Steve, where are you hanging out online these days where people can find you?
Yeah, easiest place to find me is stevecusswords.com. My last name is Cuss. There's nothing any of us can do about it, so I thought I might as well have fun with it. So stevecusswords.com, and we actually have a simple free set of courses for people who want to start on this journey. They can click through and go to my company, which is Capable Life, and they can get a free dashboard of resources and actually begin their own journey on this.
Does that include the life-giving list?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, life-giving list. They can download a life-giving list. I've got a video instruction. Put yourself on your conscious list of relationships is another course that we teach. So we actually give the people a way to do that. And then the other one is the 4 spaces of anxiety. Because in any organization, the minority are generating the anxiety, the majority are carrying it, and they're making micro adjustments to keep everything going. And so in the 4 spaces of anxiety, we teach you how to walk into any situation and see where the anxiety is, who's generating it, who's carrying it. Just 3 really simple and powerful tools.
That's fantastic. We'll make sure we have separate links in the show notes to each of those 3 resources you just mentioned. So I'll have that for you. Steve, this has been a very, very rich time together today. It's helped me immensely. I think it's helped a lot of leaders too. And I just want to thank you for it.
Carey, it is such a thrill for me to get to talk to you. I'm a listener. I love your work and I've been following it. You've been such an encouragement to me. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, it's mutual. Thank you.